friends, and welcome to Simple Gifts Farmstead, and welcome to my kitchen. I want to talk to you today about how I make fast and easy sourdough bread. And this is just everyday bread, and I know that many people believe that sourdough bread is a science, and I am here to tell you that it is a bit more of an art, and it doesn't need to be nearly as fussy and difficult and complicated as some people make it. And while I'm sure that others who do see this as a science believe that their method is superior, I just believe that if something is so complicated or hard to tackle, it's the kind of thing that makes you not want to do it on a regular basis. So I want to show you how I do it. And again, I'm sure that there are many people who have a wonderful product and who love the way they do it. I want to give you an easy way that is the kind of thing that you could do at least once a week, and if you do a big batch of it, then once a week allows you to put a couple of loaves in the freezer and then pull them out whenever you want. Now, the recipe that I am going to use, and I'll give you a close-up of this and I'll tell you what I do, requires 3 hours and 20 minutes total, and that includes the prep time and the bake time. So we start with a half a cup of fed sourdough starter. Now, I want to talk to you about feeding your sourdough, and I have just completed the feeding of mine about an hour and a half ago, and that usually is about the amount of time that it takes so that the starter can get nice and bubbly if your kitchen is not super cold. It might take a little bit longer than that if it's cold in your kitchen. So what you want is for the sourdough to look super bubbly, and I'm gonna bring this around and let you see what that looks like. And I don't know whether you can see the bubbles in there, but you want it nice and bubbly so that you can see it just active and working. Now, if your sourdough starter has been in the refrigerator for a week or 2 weeks or even longer, and you fear that you have killed your starter, wait, don't throw it away, because I believe that, kind of like on the movie Princess Bride, it may be mostly dead, but I think it's something that you can probably bring back to life. So I think a lot of people give up on their starter when they think that they've already ruined it, and that's not really the case. It just might take a few more feeds to get it active and bubbly in a way that you can use it again. So to start off with the easy part of the feeding of this, many people use their metric scales and they measure out the perfect number of grams of water, of starter, and of flour. And let me say, to feed your starter, you're adding just flour and water. And then let me further say that it doesn't really matter what kind of flour that you are feeding it with, and you don't even necessarily need to be consistent with feeding it with the same flour. I want to make this super easy, and I want to tell you that you can have a wonderful daily bread without sticking to any perfect rules. So rules, I believe, are just suggestions. Unless it's something that God tells you, love God, love people, the absolute rules. All the other rules, often you should be asking, is this really a hard and fast rule, or is this something that's some guidelines? So in this case, guidelines: feed your starter flour and water, and the amount, the ratio, some people use 1 to 1 to 1. So if they were starting with this much starter, this much flour, this much water, well, you're going to come up with an enormous amount of starter there. Or some people will scoop out just as much starter as they would like to use, and they only feed that amount to be able to use for that day, and they discard the rest. Well, I feel like that's kind of wasteful, and I try to find other uses for my discard starter. And sometimes I give it to my chickens, which is healthy for them. I did another video that you can find here on the channel that I think it was called something like chicken snacks. There are a lot of recipes that you can find on the internet to use your sourdough starter, and I'm just here to say there's lots of different options for that. Don't discard it and throw it away unless you want to, and then that's fine too, because again, just a suggestion. So again, my starter is freshly fed, and the way that I fed it and simplified it is that I added some flour. I did not measure it. And I added some water, and I did not measure it. And I stirred it up so that it was the consistency of a thick pancake batter. Now, there's not a lot of science to that. That's just art. So if there's not enough water and it's a little too thick, add a little bit more. And I use lukewarm water because I think that that speeds the process a little bit there. So if it's a little too runny, add a little bit more flour and stir that up. And again, however much flour and water that it takes to make a thick pancake batter consistency. And then after it's stirred, and not over stirred, but just enough for it to mix well, then I put a loose lid on the top. This is a lid that doesn't have any kind of seal on it, so it still allows the air to get in here, and it allows the starter to breathe. Or you can cover it with a cloth or whatever, and then you just let it sit out on the counter for about an hour and a half. Again, maybe just a little bit longer if your kitchen is cold. When it's nice and bubbly, that means your starter is ready to use. So that's the feeding of the starter. That is the simplified version. No measuring necessary, just a feel. So again, my recipe for fast and easy sourdough bread, and I've modified this a bit from a recipe that I found on the internet. So mine begins with a half cup of fed sourdough starter. So I'm going to grab a mixing bowl. And I'm going to grab my flour. And my salt. And I use real salt. If you guys are not aware of what real salt is, you want to look that up, because this is a valuable product that I believe will make a difference in your health. Okay, so again, half cup of the sourdough starter. So I'm just going to use a half cup measuring. I'm going to reach down in here and good enough is. So close to a half cup. And I'm going to set the starter aside. The next item is 1 cup of lukewarm water. So this is just a feel thing. I'm going to rinse my cup. Okay, so there's half a cup and a whole cup. I'm going to give that a gentle little stir. And the next item is 3 cups of bread flour. Now you can use all-purpose flour, you can use bread flour, you can use whatever kind of flour you like. If you're using whole grain flour that you have ground with your own grain mill, you might want to tweak your recipe there just a little bit, because it needs a little bit more water to soak up. But I'm just using bread flour, so again, 3 cups of that. And I'm going to put the bread flour aside. and 1 teaspoon of salt. Again, art, not science. You can measure this if you like, or you can kind of eyeball it. Salt aside. Okay, that's it. That's all the ingredients. We have 1/2 cup of fed starter, 1 cup of lukewarm water, 3 cups of bread flour or all-purpose flour, and 1 teaspoon of salt. And then we're going to mix all of these ingredients together. And I'm starting with a spoon here, but I'm going to move to using my hands with that. When it starts to get a little stringy, that's when I move into the hands. And I'm just going to continue to sort of knead the rest of the flour into the ball. If there's a little bit of flour left in the bottom of the bowl, that's okay. But if you start to turn the bread in on itself, you're going to expose an area of the dough that is still a little bit moist. So often you're able to work a little more of the flour into the dough. And I don't know whether you can see clearly what I'm doing, but I'm turning it out on itself. When you expose the wet, then you add the dry. And when you have most of the flour worked in, and I have just about all of it worked in there, then you form a nice little ball. You put it into your bowl like this. You might want to give your hands a little bit of rinse. You cover it with a towel and you let it rest for 30 minutes. So while this is resting, I'll give you a pause and I'll see you in a little. So 30 minutes are up and next step is ready. So I'm going to take the towel off the bowl and I'm going to grab a piece of parchment. I'm going to remove the dough ball from the bowl, set that aside for a minute, and I'm going to fold it over several times. And so you saw me doing this process in the beginning when I was mixing it, and the dough should become a little more elastic than it initially was. And you're going to fold it over itself several times. And I'm going to lean it on the parchment. I'm going to make sure you guys can see this. I'm going to flatten it out. And I'm going to roll it over on itself. Flatten it out and roll it over on itself. Flatten it out and roll it over on itself. So this just makes sure that the dough becomes more elastic and smooth. And after you've done this several times, you form it right back into a ball. Whoops. Now temporarily I'm going to set this back in the bowl, but we're going to put that on the parchment. So I'm going to take just a little bit of flour and sift on the parchment. Put a little on my hands. Gonna make sure we have a nice ball formed. And I'm gonna put it on the flour, and I'm gonna sift just a bit of flour on top of the ball. And that's the next step. We're gonna cover it again with the towel, and we're gonna let that rest and double for about an hour and a half. If your kitchen is warm, an hour and a half should be plenty. Again, if your kitchen is cold, it might take up to 2 hours for this. But we want this ball to rest and to rise. And then we'll be back here in a few minutes, and I'll show you how to put that in the oven. So while this dough continues to rise, I need to both preheat the oven, and I also need to preheat my Dutch oven. Now, a Dutch oven is just a really heavy cast iron pan, and if for some reason you don't have a Dutch oven, that does not mean that you can't bake sourdough. It just means one of the process steps needs to be altered just a little bit, and you can still bake sourdough just simply on a baking sheet, but I do prefer the Dutch oven. So if you have one of those, this is the step that you would need to follow. Now you need to preheat your oven to 500 degrees. So make sure whatever pan you are using is rated for 500 degrees. Dutch ovens always are, but if you're using a different kind of baking bowl or pan, make sure that it's rated for the 500 degrees. So I'm going to place my Dutch oven inside the oven to preheat before I ever put the dough ball into the Dutch oven. And when that's preheated to 500, and when my dough is risen to almost double, we'll come back and I'll catch you up with the next step. Okay, the sourdough has rested for an hour and a half. It is not quite double like I thought that it would be, but small is okay, and it will continue to rise in the oven. So the next thing that I'm going to do is take a super sharp knife, and I'm going to do a couple little designs in the top, and this can be any kind of design that you want, because the real purpose of the cuts is really just to let the bread vent. So just a couple little cuts in the top of the loaf. Some people make some pretty leaf designs, or they make a snowflake, or any other thing that you can think of. Okay, so we have this on the parchment. I'm not going to disturb this. The oven is preheated again. It's to 500 degrees. And I preheated the oven along with the Dutch oven. So temporarily, I'm going to take the Dutch oven out. Super careful there. I'm going to pick up the parchment, put it down inside the Dutch oven, put the lid on, back in the oven, and we're going to set the timer for 20 minutes. And let's see, let me check the recipe here to make sure that it's 20 minutes. 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And I'm going to come back in 30 minutes, take the lid off, bake it another 5 to 10 minutes, and then it will be done. So we'll be back. It's time to take off the lid. Put it back in for 5 more minutes. Okay, time to take it out of the oven. And next you carefully take the parchment, very carefully, because again this is 500 degrees. Now, a very important part here is that you do not want to cut this bread until it is completely cool, because this bread is going to continue to bake from the inside, and if you cut it now it would be doughy inside. If you wait, it's going to be nice and crisp, and I'll show you what that looks like as soon as it's cool. Okay, I believe the bread is cooling enough to cut, so I'm going to transfer it over onto the cutting board from the parchment, and we'll see how this goes. First I'll let you see how it looks, and I don't know whether the microphone will pick this up. You guys hear that? So I'm gonna nice and crusty. So this bread recipe is good for everyday bread. It's good for toasting. It's good for butter. You could flatten this out and bake it in a long loaf and use it as Italian. And we're just going to test here. And I'll let you guys see the close-up texture. It'll look good enough to eat. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for joining me at the Simple Gifts Farmstead Kitchen, and feel free to join me here again to see what we're doing next time. Bye.